The first morning I woke up in my own home as a stranger, 12-year-old Willa stood at the foot of my bed with her arms crossed and said the words that would change everything. "Dad said we're moving in. He said you'd understand. He said you'd take care of us now, since that's basically your job." I remember the sun was barely up, the light still soft and gray through the curtains, and I remember thinking that a child should never be able to make an adult feel this small with just a handful of words. But she did. And that morning was only the beginning. If you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet strength it takes to hold a broken family together, I invite you to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one remind us that love is rarely simple, but it is almost always worth fighting for. Now let me tell you how it all began. My name is Margaret Calloway, though most people who love me call me Meg. I was 34 years old when I married Walter Hensley, a soft-spoken carpenter with tired eyes and a laugh that came rarely but meant everything when it did. I had never been married before. I had built a small life for myself running a flower shop on the corner of Elm and Ninth, a life I was proud of, quiet and orderly, filled with the scent of lilies and the particular satisfaction of watching something grow under your own care. Walter walked into that shop on a rainy Tuesday afternoon looking for sympathy flowers, and he left with my phone number tucked into his jacket pocket instead. He told me later that he almost didn't ask. He said he didn't think a man with a complicated life and a grieving daughter deserved someone as steady as me. I told him that steady people are usually the ones drawn to complicated lives, because we know how to hold things together. I did not know then how true that would turn out to be, or how much holding it would require. Walter's first wife, Priscilla, had died 3 years before I met him. Cancer, the fast and merciless kind that takes a person before the family has time to prepare their hearts for goodbye. Their daughter, Willa, was 9 when her mother passed, and by the time I met her she was 12, all sharp elbows and sharper words, a girl who had learned early that the people you love can disappear without warning, and so she had built walls around herself that no amount of homemade cookies or patient smiles could easily climb. I understood grief. My own father had died when I was young, and I remembered the particular fury that comes with loss, the way you want to punish the whole world for daring to keep spinning when someone precious has stopped breathing. So when Willa was cold to me during our early meetings, when she rolled her eyes at my jokes and refused the bracelet I gave her for her 13th birthday, I told myself to be patient. I told myself that love isn't a transaction, that you don't give it expecting something back. I believed, foolishly perhaps, that time and consistency would be enough to soften her. Walter and I married in a small ceremony in his sister's backyard, string lights hung between 2 oak trees, 40 guests, and a chocolate cake that Willa refused to eat a single bite of. She wore a plain gray dress instead of the blue one Walter had picked out for her, and she stood at the edge of every photograph, never quite in the frame, never quite part of the day. I noticed. Of course I noticed. But I told myself that a wedding was hard for a girl who had already lost one mother and now had to watch her father promise his life to someone else. I told myself I would earn her trust slowly, the way you earn the trust of a wounded animal, by simply showing up, again and again, without demanding anything in return. For the first year of our marriage, Willa lived primarily with her Aunt Dorothy, Walter's older sister, a decision that had been made before I ever entered the picture, back when Walter was working long hours trying to keep his carpentry business afloat after Priscilla's death and couldn't manage a grieving child alone. Dorothy was strict but fair, and under her roof Willa seemed, if not happy, at least stable. Walter and I settled into a quiet rhythm in our little house on Maple Street, the house I had helped him choose, the house where I planted tulips along the front walk and hung curtains I had sewn myself. I believed, in my naivety, that this was simply how our life would unfold. Willa would visit on weekends. We would slowly build something resembling a family. I did not know that Dorothy's health was already beginning to fail, that the woman who had quietly held Willa's world together was fighting a battle with her heart that none of us fully understood until it was too late to prepare. Dorothy passed away on a Thursday in early spring, and I remember the phone call, the way Walter's face went the color of ash, the the way he sat down hard on our kitchen floor as if his legs had simply stopped believing they could hold him. Willa, 13 years old, had lost her mother and now the woman who had become her second mother, all before she had even finished growing into her own body. There was no question of where she would go. Of course she would come to us. Of course Walter and I would open our home, our lives, ourselves. I want to be clear that I never once resented this decision. I loved Walter, and by extension I wanted to love his daughter, wanted desperately to be someone who made her life feel less like a series of losses and more like a place she could finally rest. What I did not anticipate was how deeply Willa's grief had calcified into something harder than sadness. It had become resentment, and I was the nearest and safest place for her to aim it. The morning she told me we were moving in, standing at the foot of my bed with her arms crossed, was the morning everything shifted. Walter had gone to pick up her things from Dorothy's house, leaving the two of us alone together for the first time in what felt like a real, unavoidable way. I made her breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, the same breakfast I made every Sunday, and I set it in front of her with a smile I hoped looked more confident than I felt. She looked at the plate, then at me, and said, "I don't eat eggs anymore. Mom used to make me pancakes." I told her I could make pancakes instead, and I did, standing at the stove for 20 minutes while she watched something on her phone at the table, not once looking up to thank me or even acknowledge the effort. When I set the pancakes in front of her, she took 2 bites and pushed the plate away. "These aren't as good as hers," she said quietly, and though I understood, though I recognized the grief hiding beneath the cruelty, something in my chest cracked just a little. That was only the beginning of a pattern that would define the coming months. Willa began referring to me, in front of her friends and eventually in front of Walter's relatives, as the Maid. At first it was a joke, or something she presented as a joke, the kind of comment that makes everyone laugh nervously because they aren't sure if it's meant to wound. She would leave dishes in the sink and say, "That's what you're here for, right?" She would toss her laundry outside her bedroom door instead of into the hamper, and if I didn't wash it promptly, she would complain to Walter that I wasn't doing my job. She stopped calling me Meg entirely and began referring to me only as her, even when I was standing right in front of her. "Is she making dinner tonight?" she would ask Walter, as though I were an appliance whose function needed to be confirmed rather than a person capable of hearing my own name spoken with such coldness. I tried, in those early months, to explain to Walter how deeply this was affecting me, and I want to be fair to him, because he was not a man who ignored his daughter's cruelty out of malice. He was a man drowning in his own grief and guilt, a man who had watched his little girl lose everything familiar and could not bring himself to discipline her further, could not bear to be one more source of pain in a life that had already handed her so much of it. "She's grieving, Meg," he would say, his voice tired in that particular way that made arguing feel almost cruel. "She lost her mom. She lost Dorothy. Can you just give her time?" And because I loved him, and because I too believed in the healing power of time, I gave her more of it than perhaps I should have. I absorbed the comments. I did the extra laundry. I cooked the meal she rejected and tried again the next night with something new. I told myself that beneath the coldness was a child who simply needed to believe, deep down, that I would not leave the way everyone else in her life had left. But grief, when it is not gently guided, has a way of curdling into something uglier, and by the time Willa turned 14, her treatment of me had crossed from careless cruelty into something more deliberate. She began inviting friends over on weekends and instructing me, in front of them, to bring snacks to her room as though I were staff summoned by a bell. She told her friends, within my hearing, that her father had married the help and that I had probably only married him for the house. I remember standing in the hallway outside her bedroom door, a tray of lemonade and cookies in my hands, listening to 13 and 14-year-old girls giggle at a joke made at my expense, and feeling something inside me go very quiet and very still, the particular stillness that comes right before a person decides they cannot keep absorbing pain silently forever. I did not tell Walter about that particular afternoon for almost a week. I did not know how to explain that it was not any single moment that had broken something in me, but the accumulation of 100 small moments, each one small enough to seem forgivable on its own, but together forming a weight I could no longer carry without acknowledging it. When I finally did tell him, sitting across from him at our kitchen table on a Sunday evening while Willa was at a friend's house, I watched his face crumple with a mixture of shame and helplessness that made me want to comfort him even as I was asking him to finally, truly see what was happening in his own home. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, and his voice cracked in a way I had never heard before. "Every time I try to correct her, I see Priscilla's face. I see my daughter losing her mother all over again, and I can't do it, Meg. I can't be the reason she hurts more than she already does." I understood his fear. But I told him, as gently as I could, that his fear was allowing his daughter to become someone neither of them would recognize in a few years' time, someone who believed cruelty was an acceptable language for grief. The turning point, the moment that forced everything into the light, came on an ordinary Tuesday in late autumn, the kind of day that seems too unremarkable to hold anything significant, and yet somehow does. Walter had been away for 3 days at a job site 2 hours north, restoring the interior of an old church, and it was just Willa and me in the house. I had picked her up from school because her ride had fallen through, and the drive home had been silent except for the radio, which she had changed to a station I didn't recognize without asking. When we arrived home, she went straight to her room, and I began preparing dinner, a simple roast chicken with vegetables, the kind of meal I hoped might, in its ordinariness, communicate some small comfort. Around 6, she came downstairs and sat at the table without a word, and I set her plate in front of her, and for a moment, just a moment, I thought perhaps this evening might be different, might be quiet in a peaceful way rather than a hostile one. Then she picked up her fork, looked at the plate, and said, "This is dry. Can you make something else? Or is that too hard for you?" And something in me, some reservoir that had been slowly filling for 2 years, finally overflowed. I did not raise my voice. I want to be clear about that, because I have thought about this moment many times since, and I am proud that even in that instant, even with my heart pounding and my eyes stinging with tears I refused to let fall, I did not shout. I simply set down the serving spoon I was holding, looked at her directly, and said, "Willa, I have made you breakfast, lunch, and dinner nearly every day for 2 years. I have washed your clothes, driven you to school, sat outside your door when you were sick with the flu because you asked me not to leave. I am not your maid. I am not your enemy. I am a person who has tried, every single day, to make room for you in a life you never asked to share, and I am tired of being treated like I don't matter in the home I have poured myself into. I love your father, and because I love him, I have loved you too, even when you have made that very hard to do. But I cannot keep absorbing your pain as though it doesn't cost me anything. It costs me everything, Willa. Every single day." Willa stared at me, and for the first time in 2 years, I saw something other than contempt cross her face. I saw shock, certainly, because I had never spoken to her this way before, had never allowed my hurt to be visible in front of her. But beneath the shock, just for a flicker of a second before she rebuilt her walls, I saw something that looked almost like recognition, as though some small part of her had been waiting for someone to finally refuse to let her cruelty go unanswered. She didn't say anything. She pushed back from the table, and I thought she would storm upstairs the way she always did when conversations became too uncomfortable. Instead, she sat there, staring at her plate, her jaw tight, and after a long silence, she said, so quietly I almost didn't hear it, "You don't get it. Everyone who's supposed to stay leaves. My mom left. Aunt Dorothy left. If I let myself need you, and you leave too, I don't think I'll survive it." And then she did go upstairs, quickly, before I could see whether she was crying, though I suspected she was, because her voice had cracked in a way that no amount of teenage bravado could disguise. I sat alone at that kitchen table for a long time after she left, the roast chicken going cold between us, and I thought about everything Willa had lost and everything she had never been given the tools to process. I thought about how a 12-year-old girl watching her mother's body grow smaller and smaller in a hospital bed does not have the emotional vocabulary to say, "I am terrified of losing you too," and so instead she says, "These pancakes aren't as good as hers," because cruelty is so much easier to voice than fear. I thought about how she had watched her father remarry, watched a stranger move into the home her mother had once filled, and instead of feeling relief that her father was not alone, she had felt the ground shift beneath her all over again, one more proof that nothing in her life could be trusted to stay the same. And I thought about myself too, about the exhaustion I had been carrying, about how right it was to finally name it, and how naming it did not make me a bad person, or a bad stepmother, but simply a human being who needed, occasionally, to be seen. When Walter came home 2 days later, I told him everything, including what Willa had said about people leaving, and I watched him absorb it the way you absorb a truth you have been avoiding for a long time. I've been so afraid of losing her trust that I forgot she needs boundaries just as much as she needs gentleness, he said, sitting on the edge of our bed with his head in his hands. I think I've let her believe that grief excuses cruelty, and that's not fair to her either, because someday she'll be an adult who doesn't know how to be in a relationship with anyone. We decided together, that night, that things needed to change, not through punishment or ultimatums, but through honesty, real honesty, the kind that requires everyone in a family to be a little braver than they want to be. The following weekend, Walter sat Willa down, and I sat beside him, and for the first time since I had entered her life, the three of us spoke to each other as equals rather than as a girl defending her grief against two adults tiptoeing around it. Walter told her, his voice steady but full of love, that he understood how much she had lost, and that he would carry the guilt of not protecting her from that loss for the rest of his life, but that he could no longer allow her to treat me the way she had been treating me, because it was hurting not just me, but the person she was becoming. He told her that her mother would never have wanted her to build a life out of walls and cruelty, that Priscilla had been, by every account he gave, a woman of tremendous warmth, and that honoring her memory meant carrying that warmth forward, not burying it beneath anger. Willa cried during that conversation, really cried, for the first time I had ever witnessed, and through her tears she told us things she had never said aloud before. She told us she remembered her mother's hands more than her mother's face now, and that this terrified her, because it felt like even her memories were leaving her the way everyone else had. She told us she had been cruel to me because some small, ugly part of her had wanted to prove that I would leave too, that if she pushed hard enough, she could control when the abandonment came instead of waiting helplessly for it to happen on its own terms. I remember reaching across the table and taking her hand, something I had wanted to do for 2 years but had never been permitted to do, and telling her that I understood fear disguised as anger better than she knew, because I had lost my own father young, and grief had made me difficult too, in my own quieter way. I told her that I was not going anywhere, that I had chosen her father knowing full well I was choosing her too, and that love, real love, does not disappear just because someone makes it difficult to give. I told her that I did not need her to call me mother, did not need her to erase the woman who came before me, but that I did need her to see me, to know my name, to understand that I was a person with feelings that could be hurt and a heart that had been trying, clumsily and imperfectly, to make room for her from the very beginning. That conversation did not fix everything overnight, and I want to be honest about that, because stories that suggest a single tearful conversation solves years of grief and resentment do a disservice to how healing actually works. There were still hard days in the months that followed. There were still moments when Willa's old defenses would rise up, when a bad day at school or a memory of her mother would leave her short-tempered and distant. But something fundamental had shifted. She began, slowly, to say please and thank you, not out of obligation but because the word started to mean something to her again. She began calling me Meg instead of her, and the first time she did it, casually, as though it had always been that way, I had to excuse myself to the bathroom so she wouldn't see me cry. She started leaving her laundry in the hamper. Small things. Ordinary things. But ordinary things, I have learned, are often the truest measure of love, because love is rarely a single grand gesture. It is 1,000 small choices, repeated daily, to show up for someone even when it would be easier not to. The real turning point, the moment I knew we had crossed into something new and lasting, came about 8 months after that conversation, on a warm Saturday in early summer. Willa had been invited to a friend's birthday party, and she came downstairs before leaving, hovering in the kitchen doorway in a way that told me she wanted to say something but wasn't sure how. Finally, she asked if I would help her pick out an outfit, something she had never once asked me to do in the 2.5 years I had known her. We spent an hour together going through her closet, and I remember the particular joy of that hour, the way she laughed at a dress she had worn to her mother's funeral and said she couldn't believe she used to think it was fashionable, the way she asked my opinion and actually seemed to want it. When we finally settled on an outfit, she looked at herself in the mirror and then looked at me and said, quietly, "Thank you for not giving up on me. I know I made it really hard." I told her that I never once considered giving up, not truly, not even on the worst days, because giving up on her would have meant giving up on the family her father and I had chosen to build, and I did not believe in building things halfway. Not long after, Willa asked if she could show me something, and she led me to her room and pulled a small wooden box from beneath her bed, the kind of box a person keeps only their most precious things inside. She opened it and showed me photographs of her mother, letters Priscilla had written her before she passed, meant to be opened at different ages, a lock of hair, small treasures that told the story of a life cut short. She told me she had never shown these things to anyone, not even her father, because she was afraid that sharing them would somehow make the grief more real, more permanent. But she wanted to show me, she said, because she trusted me now, and because some part of her recognized that I had never once tried to replace her mother, only to stand beside the memory of her, to make room for both of us in her heart at the same time. I held one of Priscilla's letters in my hands, a woman I had never met but whose love for her daughter was written so plainly in every careful word, and I told Willa that her mother's love was not something I was competing with, that it lived in her, permanent and unshakable, and that my job was simply to love her in the present the way her mother had loved her in the past, not instead of it, but alongside it. Walter, when he came home that evening and found us sitting together on Willa's bedroom floor surrounded by photographs and old letters, stood in the doorway for a long moment before either of us noticed him there, and later he told me that watching that scene had been one of the great reliefs of his life. The moment he finally believed the family he had been so afraid of breaking had instead, somehow, against every fear he carried, begun to heal. The years that followed were not without their difficulties, because that is simply the nature of family, the nature of blending two lives that were never meant, in their original design, to fit together. There were arguments about curfews, about grades, about the ordinary friction that exists between any parent and any teenager. But the foundation beneath those arguments had changed entirely. Willa no longer treated our disagreements as evidence that I did not belong in her life. She argued with me the way children argue with parents who love them, with the underlying trust that the relationship itself was not in danger, that we could disagree and still, at the end of the day, sit down together for dinner and mean it when we said goodnight. She began asking my advice about things that mattered to her, about friendships and eventually about her first heartbreak, a boy named Callum who broke up with her the week before her school formal, and I remember sitting on her bed at 11 at night, long after Walter had gone to sleep, letting her cry into my shoulder the way I imagine her mother would have, had she lived to see this ordinary, devastating, beautiful moment of adolescent heartbreak. When Willa turned 17, she gave a speech at a school event about resilience, and though I had heard pieces of it while she practiced in her room, I was not prepared for what she said when she stood at that podium in front of a gymnasium full of parents and teachers. She spoke about losing her mother, about the aunt who had raised her afterward and then also left her too soon, and about how she had spent years believing that love was something that always, eventually, disappeared. And then she talked about me, though she did not use my name at first, simply calling me the woman who refused to leave. She said that I had shown up for her on days she had done everything in her power to push me away, that I had made her breakfast even when she threw it back in my face, that I had waited outside locked doors and answered late-night phone calls and never once, not one single time in 5 years, made her feel like a burden, even when she had tried her hardest to be one. She said that watching me love her, imperfectly and persistently, had taught her that some people do stay, that love is not always the grand romantic gesture we see in movies but is instead the quiet, unglamorous decision to keep showing up, day after day, even when showing up is hard. By the time she finished speaking, I was not the only person in that gymnasium crying, and when she stepped down from the stage and walked directly to where I was sitting and hugged me in front of everyone, calling me, for the very first time in front of an audience, her mom, I understood that every difficult moment of the previous 5 years had led us, unavoidably, to this one. I think often about that first morning, about the girl who stood at the foot of my bed and told me her father said we were moving in, as though I were nothing more than staff being informed of new arrangements. I think about how easy it would have been to let that morning define our entire relationship, to decide that a child capable of such coldness was simply beyond reaching, to protect myself by keeping her at arm's length the way she had kept me. I am grateful, more grateful than words can fully capture, that I chose instead to stay soft, to stay patient, to keep offering pancakes even when they were pushed away, because I have learned that children who behave the most unlovably are often the ones who need love most desperately, who are testing, again and again, whether the people around them will finally prove their worst fears wrong. Willa is 22 now, studying to become a grief counselor, a career path she says she chose because of everything our family walked through together, because she wants to be, for other children who have lost someone, the kind of steady presence I eventually became for her. She calls me every Sunday, without fail, and last spring, when she brought home a young man named Foster to meet the family for the first time, she introduced me not as her stepmother but simply as her mom, no qualification needed, no explanation offered, because by then it had simply become true. Walter and I still live in the little house on Maple Street, though the tulips I planted years ago have long since given way to a garden Willa and I designed together the summer she turned 20, full of the same lilies that filled my shop the day her father first walked through my door. If this story touched your heart, if you have ever loved someone who made it difficult to love them, or if you yourself have ever pushed away the people trying hardest to reach you, I hope you will take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment, and share it with someone who might need this reminder today, that patience and steady love can slowly rebuild even the most broken places in a family, and that it is never too late for walls to come down. Before you go, I would love to know, in the comments below, what this story means to you. Have you ever had to earn someone's trust slowly, one small act of love at a time? Have you ever been the person who almost gave up, or the person who was too afraid to let someone stay? Please subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one, because our community believes, deeply and unshakably, in kindness, in forgiveness, in the quiet miracle of second chances, and in the truth that family is not only the people we are born to, but the people we choose to stay for, again and again, on even the hardest days. Thank you for spending this time with our family's story, and I hope, wherever you are today, that you find someone worth staying for, and that someone finds the courage to stay for you.